Cortot. Just recently, and I love it. I wanted to hear your thoughts about that work.
Yes, well, that book is based on the wrist. It's all about the flexibility of the wrist. And I studied with many students of Cortot in the Paris École Normale school that he created. And a lot of his exercises are based on the tips of the fingers stay bolted to the keys, but the wrist and the arm are very flexible. It has advantages and it has also disadvantages. There is a pianist, very famous Canadian one called Marc-André Hamelin, who came to Bloomington to play a concert, and I begged him to come give a master class to my students, and he told me, I don't believe in teaching. And I was like, what? And he told me that his teacher in French Canada obliged him, I quote him, to use Cortot's fingerings against his will. And so he decided that he won't teach because he doesn't want to impose fingerings to his students. Now, the fingerings of Cortot must have been specifically more peculiar. There is something about the fact that Cortot has a specialty about his interpretation in Chopin, is to always play the two hands not together. Chopin used to say, I want my left hand to ignore what my right hand does. Supposedly. He said that, supposedly. And so if you play something like... with the melody, Cortot considered that the expression for Chopin, the rubato, which is secretive, you know, what is rubato? Or how much is rubato, rather, is to play a delay between the bass and accompaniment with the melody to bring the melody always out like an aria. So it will be... which systematically becomes today very funny. People laugh if you do. But when he was playing, the audiences were, oh, Cortot. God in Cortot. And I think his treatise is more about technique. And his work editions are more about practicing, especially the one about the Chopin Etudes, which he wrote in 1930. Have you seen that score? Besides you. Any of them? It's the kind of score that students usually dread, is because there are 2 music staff lines per page, and the rest of the page are indications how to practice them by Cortot. So it sounds more like a pharmaceutical approach of music, where you have to read all the medical advantages and disadvantages of each medicine you take. And so most of students I know like to play, not to practice. Let's read. But Cortot initiated this publishing work editions. And so if you play the first etude, you would practice He was a great admirer of this exercise I call hold and poke. Some people call it double legato, which is you hold one note and then you staccato the next. To strengthen the fingers in independence as well as to organize when you lift the note, like this. It demands a lot of patience. And then one only. So of course he advocates also the rhythmic practice, like or something like in the second etude. The problem is that if the students apply the amount of practicing that it demands, since Chopin wrote these etudes as a marathon rather than a sprint, everybody can play the beginning of the etude and then get stiff and starts hurting and ends up with tendinitis. So those practicing exercises sometimes are very, they pull a lot on the tendon, and it's very dangerous. An example is Opus 10 number 9. So he advocates what we can call upper rotation. Is instead of doing around, you go above. So it becomes like a vault jump. And your middle finger has to be very long and straight from the knuckle, and not around. Makes it more like rowing. So in many aspects, those exercises pushed to their limit can hurt. But the problem is that Chopin's writing the etudes was mostly about, before Cortot obviously, was about endurance and about flexibility of the hand. Whenever Czerny, who was the Chopin etudes before Chopin, about, well, he was Beethoven's student. I always think it's a terrible thing as an inheritance. Beethoven is the greatest composer, and his most famous student is Czerny. Mr. Etudes for practicing. I mean, he wrote a 5-movement sonata people ignore, but most of it, he's famous for his exercises. And you would think, why? But anyway, the idea in the 18th century, earlier in Beethoven's time, was that the hand has to be strengthened. It's too weak, so it has to be strengthened. Whenever Chopin was the flexibility of the hand. And so you have the 10th in the first etude, and then the stretch and the retract to the 3rd. Of course, he was so inspired by Bach's first prelude. So I give my students often to play the harmonization of the first prelude by Bach on the etudes of Chopin patterns. To even more make it Bach as Chopin thought of it, but Chopin didn't use the same harmonies. He was trying to imitate. So in the spirit of Cortot, I wrote my own piano technique exercises for my students. And I know that I had emphasized on each page, 5 minutes practice, 5 minutes rest. 5 minutes practice, 5 minutes rest. And you can notice that children, prodigies or even not prodigies or obliged to practice children, rarely have tendinitis because they really don't like to practice. So they don't hurt themselves. It's always young students who pay a lot of tuition and who have to have a deadline and who realize that the teacher said this has to be even, this has to be independent, and they're impatient with themselves, and then they enter in the practice room and they stay there for longer than they should to try to force it. It's like as if because you will be taking the medication for the flu through a week, you take it for an hour, all of them, and you'll be cured faster. We know it's not the case, but for practicing, I always worry that my students get tendinitis. So I make sure the exercises are not meant to overstretch, while they need to help independence of 4 and 5. I also work a lot, like corto independence, but also on the whole tone disposition, which he claims comes from Chopin's teaching. This is better disposed for the long fingers on the black keys, which are higher, and the short fingers on the white, because they're lower. And then I work a lot on the flexibility of the thumb, by making the practicing of the scale thumbs, and then the non-thumbs together, like this. So you can in order to flexibly, very flexible, with flexibility, retract the thumb under the hand, in order not to move the wrist when you play past the scale. But I know that even if you take the Brahms 51 exercises, the Czerny etudes, the Chopin etudes in the Cortot edition, or Cortot's own exercises, which are a lot about flexibility of the wrist, it remains nevertheless that pianists play with the tip of the fingers. Therefore, there has to be a grip from the palm that is very solid, while the wrist remains very flexible, in order not to have a tendon tension and play like Pinocchio, wooden, because you try to keep the imprint, especially with octaves. Or very often students would just try, or the third scherzo. They're playing it from the forearm. And so it becomes very stiff. That's why I call it the Pinocchio style. It's like wooden arm. But it works in the beginning, and towards the end it hurts. So the ideal is to try to practice the equivalent of wrist flexibility with palm support and fingers precision that can do an octave exact imprint, and rebounds from the fingers and the wrist, and use the synergy of the precision and the rebouncing. This way you don't get to be stiff, and at the same time you're precise. Technique never ends. But the problem is that very often I notice my newer generation of students don't like to practice technique, scales, exercises, arpeggios. They like to practice the technique within the piece. Perhaps some of you recognize themselves in that.
Emile,
It's not possible, I'm just trying to say. It has to be practiced separately. I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no,
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Yeah, no, because there are like some pianists and also some composers in the audience. I also would like you to talk a little bit about your experience with Mademoiselle Boulanger. I mean, I know that it's...
I like the applaudissement. First of all, I absolutely want to thank Maestro Monteiro because he invited me here so graciously, and he just mentioned my teacher's name by Mademoiselle.
Mm-hmm.
And this is to me...
Well, first of all, we should stand up before saying her name, right?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but hot butter to my soul. Because too many people call her Nadia with this kind of post-mortem familiarity. It's like as if you say, yeah, Leonardo painted Da Vinci's paintings. It's Maestro, hopefully, for a painter. And in French, mademoiselle means miss. And the tradition is that you call an unmarried lady mademoiselle until death, if that is the case. And many people called her either madame, which was wrong, or Nadia. So thank you for saying mademoiselle. She didn't make a distinguished difference between interpretation, performance, and composing. And that is what I think comes from the tradition of the 19th century from which she was based, since she was born in 1887. People gathered to read music, and the concept of rehearsal didn't exist. They read. And therefore, the interpretation was not separate from the composition. It was all in one, because it was a language. And it was a common language, which is called the tonal system. And that allowed them to quickly, because people traveled less and lived less long, they acquired the music knowledge of the area of the time where they were. And Mademoiselle Boulanger said something very touching one day to me about that, because she said, it's given to composers to write the music with the tools which they received from their predecessors. And they didn't find the necessity to break the rules to create their own, in order to express their own musical expression. But some did. For instance, Schoenberg. And it didn't occur to any of the 19th century composers, especially virtuoso pianists, Chopin, Liszt, Rachmaninoff, and Scriabin, to take a few, to write atonal. Some consider they attempted. Perhaps it's a question of how you word it. Tonal-centered, tonal-altered, bitonal, semitonal, I don't know. But in any case, the tonality was the common alphabet. And I think that when Rachmaninoff was alive until World War II, he was aware that music has gone atonal quite for many decades before he became old. And it didn't stop him from writing post-Chopin music. I don't know of an atonal concerto by Rachmaninoff. And it's a beautiful thought, because in some aspects, today's music of Rachmaninoff is sort of like timeless. We don't think, oh my God, he's such late romantic. And then people have trouble putting in order of hierarchy or chronology, when in schools of music we have to teach music theory and history of music. So is Schubert romantic? Because he died a year after Beethoven, and he was much younger. And the example of the Opus 90 of Chopin is so obvious, because when you hear this, and you have no idea who composed it, you would think it's Schubert. As if Beethoven was inspired by Schubert, when unfortunately he never even knew his existence in the same city of Vienna. But there is some kind of a transition that goes from one composer to another. An example is Mozart writes this. And Beethoven will write. And so the reason I give these examples is because style and chronology don't always match. And people often call contemporary music even of dead composers, even recently, like Ligeti, Dutilleux, or others. But contemporis in Latin means at the same time. So therefore, only living composers can be contemporary. The problem is that the chronology doesn't matter, because if the contemporary composer, in my case, is alive so far, I write music that could have been written in the 19th century. So in fact, I am not a 21st century composer, I just compose in the 21st century, but my music could have been written in the 19th century. And therefore, I think that what Mademoiselle Boulanger said about the fact that some composers don't need to question what they receive as an inheritance in order to present what they have to say in music. Like Chopin didn't say, okay, Bach is finished, or Schumann didn't think after Mozart, there's no point. So why all of a sudden, after Schoenberg, are we told that we cannot write music that is tonal? It's a little bit of a problem, because if some people need that, then they need to. But the problem with the post-tonal music is that then the composers are no more as universal, because they have a language that you have to learn before to even be able to taste their music. And so that kind of thought brings me to think that the composers and the performers, until let's say the 19th century, were the same. Nobody invited Mozart to play in a salon other than his music. Nobody even imagined to ask him to play some Bach. Liszt is the first pianist who started playing in public music of others. Rachmaninoff played Scriabin after Scriabin's death. These are like the openings into repertoire of a recital. But most of the time, if you invite let's say if you invited, instead of me, Chopin, you wouldn't expect him to play a piece by another composer. And then you would think, was that interpretation right? Did the composer know best about his own music? And then you enter in this very interesting cycle of composing as an improvisation which is settled on score to remain frozen. And then re-enters in a fresh new approach of a student who discovers it or rediscovers it and puts it into their own equivalent of a microwave, and they reheat it from the frozen transmission, which is only the score. And then, of course, the teacher comes in between, like some kind of a lawyer on behalf of the estate. Oh no, you're not supposed to do this. That's not the right tempo. No, it's not possible, this pedaling. No, with this phrasing, this fingering, you won't get that phrasing. And so you enter in these endless debates about, is it supposed to be so fast or so slow? And I heard it on YouTube, and I heard somebody do it this and that way. It becomes more about improvisation became a composition, and then the interpretation becomes a composition on top of it. As if the interpretation becomes a new piece in the piece. And you can say, I only like Bach by Gould. And then if you hear it by somebody else, oh, no, I cannot stand this person. They don't know what Bach is. And so we create a sense of what, and it can be for any composer, that the interpretation determines how we like it. So ideally, if the whole universe of music was educated in the sense of literate knowledge of music, you might not need recitals at all. People will gather like you today with their scores, like in a public library, silently reading them and hearing them inside themselves, differently, but enjoying them. And all of a sudden, somebody is playing the piece, and if you know the piece, chances are you'll say, I don't like it. But if you don't know the piece, you might be intrigued. Oh, it's interesting. And so then the interpretation becomes some kind of imposition of a style. And some say, oh, I only hear Chopin with, I don't know, a certain name or another name. And I think that today, in the 21st century, the composers compose, the pianists piano, the teachers teach, the musicologists musicologize, the music theorists theorize, and very few do all at the same time. And if they do, they're considered amateurs. So So it's a problem because it's good to develop a knowledge in niche, develop it in depth and say, I'm going to spend the 50 years to come to learn exactly what Szymanowski wanted. That's marvelous. But at the same time, some other people might say, I like a bit of different things too. And so I think the conclusion to this question is that interpretation. So my teacher used to say, the piece, and that's nothing to do with legal rights, the piece doesn't belong to the composer once it's adopted by the performers. The piece exists and it's beloved by the audience who can't play and by the performers who can play it, but they enjoy it at the same time. It exists by itself, beyond the composer and beyond even the performer, since the performers will change and perhaps even their interpretations will evolve. But the piece itself remains the connection between the performer and the audience. So of course you can say that emotion, human emotion, doesn't need words. It can be a gaze, it can be as a face, expression. So for emotion, you don't need to explain. The problem is when you have to explain a thought. You cannot do it just with the face. And then you have to learn the grammar of music. For instance, a fugue can be played as a piece of character music, sad or happy, fast or slow, driven or dreamy, but by itself it's absolute music. Technically it's not supposed to be a mood music, compared to the funeral march of the Chopin sonata, which by essence cannot be happy. But a fugue can be played with different points of view, which are valuable as long as they're convinced and convincing. So I find that very often to be the case with students because we seem to separate too much nowadays the interpretation from the composition. And most of the pieces were composed as an improvisation by Mozart and Chopin, for instance. Mozart's concerti were all improvised. He never even finished the piano part before it was published. It was expected. But the publishers wanted to establish, and so imagine Chopin wanted to be performed, so he sent 3 to 4 copies of each of his pieces to 3 or 4 different publishers in different countries. And since he didn't have a computer and a photocopy machine, it allowed for endless discrepancies in the copying, either by himself or by his students. And so each edition has in their vault an urtext, original text. So it gives the opportunity to say that the Polish National is better than the Henley is more accurate than the Polish National, but then there's a new Polish National, and it's nothing to do with the other ones. And so it becomes then like as if the publisher, and nowadays the recordings, and the availability through YouTube of many interpretations to compare, that interpretations are sort of like you can change the outfits of the doll when you buy a doll for a child. Instead of becoming a meaningful understanding. I have a student who told me the other day that his previous teacher taught him how it's supposed to be according to the taste of the place from where he studies, about articulation, phrasing, direction in Bach. So I said, if I tell you my taste, then you'll say, who are those people who can't agree? Teachers. So I thought, would it not be more meaningful to show him and see by himself that in Bach not all the notes are detached, or not all the notes are legato, because some are tonal, some are melodic, passing tones, some are decorative appoggiaturas. And so there is a hierarchy within Bach's music, even if on the piano, many people like to play very even. They go like, or you could do with an equal conviction but an opposite way. Or you can sort of put slurs for the melodic ones and detached for the harmonic notes. Like a passing tone will be slurred, and then the harmonic, tonic dominant, will be staccato, and then. So you start intelligently reading the meaning of the notes, instead of saying all detached, all legato, all fast, all slow. And I find that very often students are very eager, I find in my experience, to have a rule that functions for all. And so by the time you explain to a student the ways you think or hear, or you end it by searching until you find some kind of temporary truth within the interpretational choices, the student has to trust you. And I find that that trust between teacher and student is harder and harder to maintain because of the availability of the information of other interpretations. And in a way, it's a blessing because the access to all the different interpretation is so easy. But the problem is how to filter it. Because then you can say, anyway, it means something different to everybody. So if you play the pathétique and somebody says it's in 2, no, it's in 4. And you want to believe in each of them separately, you can be very convincing. You might even change mind, not during the performance. But you have to have a way to think about the music, not analytically, but only in theory, but to analyze enough to apply it on your interpretational choices. And I find very often that theorists theorize with colloquiums and presentations, and it's very interesting, but when they play, you don't always hear their thoughts. And many times performers are a little bit afraid to think too much, because then it becomes very confusing. So I will tell you how my teacher was teaching me the well-tempered clavier. Monday, Tuesday, copied by hand from the score, but on staffs, with clefs. Not piano, 2 staffs, but 4, whatever number of voices. Wednesday, Thursday, copy from memory, without piano and without the score of Bach. That becomes more difficult. And then Friday, Saturday, play the Prelude Fugue from your own score, which hopefully was not filled with mistakes. I think it was in reference to Baroque studies when a Bach teacher time, or Bach himself would teach a piece, there was no scores available, so the student would copy from the teacher's book the piece to prepare for the next lesson. And in the copying, the student inevitably adds some stuff, takes off some stuff purposely or even not purposely. And then he becomes a teacher in the next generation, and by the time we don't have an urtext, we just have a copy of a copy of a copy. But the reason for which he asked me to do this, except Sunday where I'm not supposed to touch the well-tempered clavier, was that next Monday I started the same for the next Prelude and Fugue. And that was since I was 7 and she was 84. It went on for years like that. Almost every year I restarted the cycle. And the problem was that I could solfege them, I could write them, I could visualize them in layered voice leading, but I couldn't play them because I couldn't put them together. The vertical necessity for pianists. And it became a touching conclusion to that is when she was extremely old, 94 almost. And she was lying on her, what was to be deathbed in her house. And since I studied with her while she was quite old but very dynamic, I was bothered that she was bedridden. And so I told her, Mademoiselle, vous ne vous ennuyez pas? Which means addressing her in her bed, are you not bored? And I think in retrospect I was a bit bold to ask her that. But she answered me very seriously. She said, I'm exercising my brain, she told me, by reciting myself in my head, voice by voice, fugues from the well-tempered clavier. And so she would go like, she was in bed, like, do, re, mi, fa, sol, fa, mi, la, the first prelude. And I would go, sol, la, si, do, re, do, si, mi. And we would stay like that for, I don't know how many hours. In a way, the solfège was very refreshing because it was knowing the music from inside, as if the grammar, the alphabet for the thought process. It didn't mean that in interpretation I'm not supposed to bring feelings to the fugue itself. I think the problem with the interpretation, after all, I have to play it on the piano since it's written, or at least I didn't have harpsichord. Regardless of that, it was about the keyboard. You can do it by thinking the different voices, or you can do it by bringing out a voice more than another. If I do... Okay, that's silly, it is a demonstration, but that's the way I was taught to know them. Not as a performance piece. It was more about the music itself in terms of layering and contrapuntal voicing. But then comes a point where you have to probe, but play all that what you hear. And I think that that took me the longest, to be able to play all what I heard. So when I applied it with my students, she was adorable. She entered in the studio, she said, Professor, my student told me, ignorance was bliss. Now that I hear all the voices of what I play, I cannot play it. It's too many things. I'm too much aware of everything going on. It's not just finger memory, it's not just ear connection, it's not just mood connection, or a combination of, it's organically known, as if you wrote it yourself, literally, not composed, but wrote. Or perhaps you identify to becoming a bit of a composer-performer. And what happened is that it took her a good semester to transform that beginning of theoretical knowledge of the piece to become an advantage in the performance. But it couldn't happen right away. And I think very often when we look at the two staffs piece for piano, any piece, we have stems up, stems down, we figure out their voicings, but we still try to play vertically as it fits, because we have to see how the two hands fit. I remember master classes with Richter. So Sviatoslav Richter had recorded the well-tempered clavier for LP in the early 50s. And I was a great admirer of those recordings. So when I had an opportunity to play for him well-tempered clavier pieces, first the question was, Maestro, how did you choose the tempi? Expecting to hear the golden rule. And he told me, the next day would have been the opposite. I just randomly chose one for the recording day. That was a killer. Really, because I thought I'll finally hear some kind of rule. I admire more Gould for that, because he has a very strict rule about the 16th notes articulation that sort of multiply and divide. But anyway, Victor, okay. But then Victor said something also very, that helps me every day. He told me, when you play a fugue, don't always bring out the subject every time it comes around, because you have to follow all the other parts. Therefore, he said, don't smell but every second rose in the garden. But I said, everything is beautiful in the Bach fugue. Every note, every suspension, every expression, every result. I mean, how can you choose that in a C-sharp minor, book 1, to say, okay, this voice is not important. I'll just go for But if you play intensely each, it's too much. And so you have to make a choice to layer or to voice or to bring out, and not always the subject. Sometimes you can bring a contra-subject or some voice that is there to accompany the subject's return in different keys. And that idea of smelling every second rose is very practical to me since then. And another thing which I remember about Richter is that I attended so many concerts of his, and I would be backstage after he finishes. So you could hear the audience literally in trance. And he comes back out of stage, and I see him in the green room, and he looks at me, he says, today, 30%. And the people go, "Wah! Wah!" He goes back and forth on stage, plays I don't know how many encores, but lucid. And then, when I was allowed to attend practice sessions of him, I mean, he was among the people who knew the best Beethoven sonatas. And so I thought when I will reach his age, I'll just play. What did I see? He goes in the concert hall and he goes. Literally like that. Feelingless and under tempo. And I don't make it up. I really don't. So you would think, okay, he's young, he's unexperienced. And the reason for which he told me, when I finally obtained an answer why, he told me, you always make new friends with the old pieces. And of course, since I was young, I had no idea what it means, because I had not lived. Mademoiselle Boulanger would say, for the well-tempered clavier, it's a good travel companion to life. And the interesting portion in the two of their, both of them, about this thought is that, is it you who evolve in life? Yes. Or is it the piece itself? Sometimes both. I'm almost convinced of that. So I'll conclude with the fact that when I was young, I used to play without rubato. I considered rubato affected and unnecessary. And I didn't do it vindicatively, just that it wasn't in my... So I would play the E minor Chopin Nocturne. With the direction of the line as my only aim. The sentence, the storytelling, the eloquence, the meaning. Even if each little detail inside suspension, articulation, appoggiatura was meaningful. And then, with age, I started playing everything rubato. I'm almost unable to not play. goes to work every morning to his office for one of the major companies of computers, and he listens to Spotify. And he keeps telling me, writing me, like, Dad, you played so much better Chopin when you were younger without rubatos. Why do you do all that now? It's not the same. It doesn't need that. And I was thinking, the truth always comes from the mouth of the children, even if they're adults. And it's very healthy to be able to say that. And I really understood that, in fact, perhaps I betrayed to a certain extent my teacher's teaching about music being its own language, doesn't need to be connected to the feelings only. But I find emotional connections to different pieces, even if they're not officially supposed to have one. Even fugues. And perhaps I disappointed her, but in any case, it corresponds to what I would like to honestly bring to the audience as a performer. Now, when a student asks me how much or not to do rubato, I like to say, if I'm the performer, I'll do this. But as a teacher, I encourage you not to, because I would like you to find the necessity of it. It's like, the breaking point is, I cannot not. Or I'm told not to. The publisher is not to. The recording says this. The teacher says that. And everybody tells me something, but inside me, if I really want to play the pieces, it talks to me in order for me to be meaningful in my interpretation and not just reciting something I don't believe in, or even halfway, then I cannot not. And I think that when Mademoiselle Boulanger was teaching us the very strict rules of harmony, contrapoint, and fugue, she kept always saying, all these rules are there in order for you to break them one day. But you cannot break them unless you adopt them first. The discipline, and then you learn the purpose of the discipline, and then you can allow yourself things, and you can even see that Bach almost never followed his rules. And anybody who wants to practice technique in the piece as a performer, any music theory student who wants to learn about fugues by learning Bach fugues, you realize that all the fugues of Bach are only exceptions to the rule. But you don't know that because before that is this monument of perfection that it's obviously there. And when you look at it from close up, you see that he takes little indentation with the rules here and there. And I find that very healthy, because if you learn the rules in order to break them, is because you learn the purpose of it, not just recite them for that. It's like politeness. When you're a child and somebody gives you a candy, the parent usually says, say thank you. And the child goes, thank you. But usually the child has no idea why, and just to please. I mean, after all, if they give me the candies that I'm the center of the world, it's owed to me. And then politeness and humility has to be taught until it becomes part of your behavior. Not just by politeness, but because you believe in it. To be truly humble, to be truly modest, to be truly thankful is very important and very meaningful if it's the case, not just because you learned to say that. And I find the same thing with interpretation. It has to become your way of expression. And even if you change mind through time because you evolve and the pieces remain, but yeah. So I think that composition today is a little bit too much separated from performing. And for being one who plays and composes, 99% of the composers consider me not as a composer because I'm a pianist. And all the pianists consider me not as a composer because I'm a pianist. Or they say, oh, you're a pianist but you play like a composer. And I asked her, so what does it mean? And how do you think you play like you compose the pieces? And I think that sometimes I do creative voice leading, not because I'm a composer, it's because I love the pieces. And sometimes I find that the composer didn't give me enough examples or authorizations to do. I'll give you that example of Opus 118, number 2 by Brahms. As an illustration about interpretation versus composition. The theme is CDB, I cannot say it in English. CBD, CBA. A page later it comes in the bass. What he does? And the A is sustained, but it's not repeated. If you take off the tie, you can make him do what he didn't do. So why didn't he think about it and I would think about it? Why am I better than him? Of course he's great, he's gone and he's dead mostly. And so therefore, if I feel it, I don't have the right to do that. Middle section. 2 against 3 in relative minor, and the right hand has the leading melody. In the recap of the middle section, it starts in the middle voice. And then he reinverts it. And it becomes a duo instead of a solo or aria. But the second half of the phrase, the secondary voice melts away, disappears like ice cream in the sunshine. And you go. So I felt. So I purposely made it very demonstrative. It is in the score, except it's not voiced with stems. So then Mademoiselle Boulanger would tell me, you play what he wrote, and if you don't like it, write your own piece, not your own interpretation. And so I didn't shy writing my own, but when I play the pieces I love, I feel like, why am I not allowed to bring out what I find beautiful in it? Perhaps he meant it, perhaps he didn't. Perhaps I betrayed him, and perhaps. And so the problem very often is that we are bound to the tradition, to the respect, to the discipline, and so we do. And frankly, it's gorgeously beautiful anyway. It doesn't need my voice leading to be beautiful. I'm not that self-centered, even if I appear to in this example. But it's not really a problem, because I think that if I teach that, it's a double-edged sword. It's like you give a student a freedom that is not supposed to use. And so you feel like then you shouldn't say anything. Is it respect the text? The text was here before us, the text will be there after us, we're just passing by, which is true. People played it in the 20s, people played it in the 50s, people played it in the 90s, people, etc. So we have now the recordings to prove it, and the Cortos and the Kempfs and the Rubinsteins and all these people. Whichever edition they used, whichever musicianship they had, they expressed it in their playing. How much rubato did the one, how little the other one did. But it was their truth. And I try to bring to my students a certain analytical understanding of the score, but motivated by the expression and the soul, not just the brain. Because I find it very difficult to always have to come up with a reason. I'll bring that out because it's symmetrically better. Bring that less, don't bring that because the composer didn't say it. And so you end up by thinking, So if I just reproduce what everybody else did, what do I bring to the piece? After all, during the moment you perform the piece that others did, it is yours. And I find that very beautiful, because we always think about music is, classical music is from the past and is dead, and it's like a dead language. But in fact, while we play the music of the past, I don't think we think of it as past. Anybody who plays the first ballade by Chopin plays it as if it's today. But I think that with the communication system of today, I don't think they use pigeons with little roll and love me not, hope, expect, and in the interval of expecting, I write a love poem, I write a fantasy, I write an opera, or I write a theater play. In the longing comes the art. And today, you can break up with your girl or boyfriend with a text message. So therefore, the first ballade by Chopin, which is based so much on expecting, and you feel that expression of humanity that is yearning. So you would go just for the ballad would be, okay, that's a little bit the result of the day of today. So if you do atonal, it would go and you do. So, but while you played, you know it's 19th century, obviously, because you learn. But when you play it, while you practice it, I think you think it's today. It's you. It's not you in a museum, you in a puppet theater, or you in some kind of a presentation of something that is no more actual. And many times when you have friends who are not musicians, who say, what are you doing to play all the time these old things? Can't you play new music? And for them it's obviously hip-hop today. It was rock before, etc. The difference between that kind of popular modern music and the classical, I think, is that they associate the music to the moment and not imagining that we have centuries of music with different styles that we study more than before because we have access to all that. So we learn about a sense of style, a sense of it's sort of a cultivated playing. If I start with my Bach, I will do trills this way, and then I'll play the trills in the Barcarolle by Chopin. They won't be the same sounding because they're more like a vibrato. So all kinds of things that bring to your audience through your understanding that this music, while old or from another time period, is relevant while you play it and becomes so meaningful. I love when people say after a concert, I loved your music. And you look at them and you say, but Brahms wrote that. It's not my music, I just played his music. And the beauty of it is this rupture of disbelief, as the English theater teachers do speak about, is that the actor starts acting and you know it's a lie, you know it's let's pretend, but you get so involved in the way they present it that you start believing in the story. You have a rupture of the disbelief. And all of a sudden you can accept the story and the eloquence of it instead of rejecting it by saying, oh, anyway, it's just pretending, you know. And I think it's a way of feeling the music that is eternal away from its time period. So I guess if I'm only a performer, I will do it through my playing, but when I teach, I have to explain it. And it's very difficult to explain a bittersweet kiss. It's very difficult to explain a mood that can be ambiguous. And you start explaining, and at the end of it you realize that the more you explain, the more you belittle the piece. The piece, in a way, has ingredients of this and of that mean more to one person and different ingredients more to others. That's why international jury members never agree. And usually the audience loves a performer and the jury didn't, and they'll be like, how come the best didn't win? So it's just in the eye of the beholder. And I find that it's better to accept it and to agree that speaking about it is more limited than playing it. That makes me very happy to transition to the masterclass portion, where I can hear them play rather than only hear me speak.
Yeah. Before we go to masterclass, we only have 5 minutes actually. I would like you to, since you mentioned Richter, I would like you to mention, to say a little bit to us the relationship between Mademoiselle Boulanger with Richter and with Stravinsky. You have 6 minutes. Because you were such a, you saw all of this.
Well, more than so, I felt it.
Yeah.
But so my teacher had a Russian mother and a French father. And her first name, Nadia, means hope in Russian. Originally Nadezhda, and Nadia is the nickname. So she had a soft spot for Slavic musicians. Her connection to Richter was through God. Richter had these visions when he was playing. It's very precisely the E-flat major sonata, small movement. And he would stay so disturbingly long silence than the rhythmic indication only. And he came out from that concert with a percentage number. And then Mademoiselle Boulanger and I went to him backstage after the concert reception and all that. And he said to her that he saw God during the rests of that performance that evening. And my teacher, who had a peculiar religious feeling, it's not, she didn't only deify God, she deified people who she admired, like her sister, who was a composer, and so on. She took the words of Richter to its value. It wasn't like a reception after concert conversation where people say superficial and unsuperficial things with more or less meaning to it, either for fashion, either for attitude, you know. It was a very intense moment, and I attended this ping pong between them two speaking to each other in German, since my teacher's Russian wasn't as good, and Richter was German by his father. And they could speak in German and exchanged about that. And so she mentioned to him that in the Leeds competition, she was in the jury, she heard the Pariah play the Liszt sonata, and she thought also that the rests were what we can call pregnant rests, interrupting the silence music. And so they ended by talking about a certain supernatural expectation where the music is not interrupted, but the silent interrupts the music. The music is interrupted by the silence. There is this kind of importance of the density of the silence. It's a kind of unusual conversation when people around eat and drink, because it's a reception after the concert. And she referred very often to the spirituality of Richter. As to Stravinsky, the situation is tragic for her. I think that she was the most suitable partner for his life. I'm not a matchmaker. There's a matchmaker in reverse time zone timing, because Stravinsky, like Picasso, like great 20th century geniuses, meaning transcended by their gift, produced an art that's bigger than them. But while they were themselves, meaning men, they were extremely limited in their understanding of women. And my teacher was terrifying to the students because she was more austere than a pope or a candle and more heartwarming than anybody at the same time. She had this capacity to be intelligent and compassionate, but at very high levels and at the same time, which is very disturbing. If men have their, especially men of such genius, have their set rules about what life is and what a woman is in their lives to be. And I regret very much that Mademoiselle Boulanger and Stravinsky did not end up living a parallel creative life, because I think that would have been incredibly more producing beautiful art. So Stravinsky was impressed and I think disturbed by the strong character, personality of my teacher. He liked women to be not that. And during the years before World War II, he was in Paris, and his wife died, and his daughter died from flu, and he got very close to my teacher. The two mothers lived actually, Stravinsky's and Boulanger's two Russian mothers lived together and cooked together, and there was sort of an artistic kinship that was through the Russian background, but music mostly. And then during World War II, they both immigrated in the United States, where he remarried with the ex-ballerina of the Ballet Russe, and not with my teacher. This is how I see the things way, way later than that happened, because I arrived in her life in the last decade after she lived already 80 years before me, 70. And I regret that because I think that she was beyond gender. And I think she could think more openly than others. If she had students who wanted to study serial music, she taught serial music to this composer. She did not have an attitude to say, no, just neoclassicism, no, just bitonalism, no, just this, just that, because Fauré was her teacher, Stravinsky was her mentor, so of course, all her students will compose in this style. Not at all. She always was helpful to bring the student to become who they are supposed to become. It's a difficult thing to say in few words, but that's the fact. And I think that with Stravinsky, she premiered pieces of his, she conducted pieces of his, she commissioned pieces of his, she analyzed pieces of his, she probably knew better some of his pieces than him, analytically speaking. Of course, she admired him immensely, but I think that that kinship ended with his remarriage and her return after World War II in France, and he remained in the States. And there are letters exchanged between them that show a lot of the inner world, inner life turmoils. I mean, first of all, the whole world was in turmoil because of a world war, the second in their own lives, which is already tough enough to go through, plus their own personal relationships. But with Richter, there was not such a tension because there was no, I would say, sentimental connection. It was more spiritual through the religiosity. She didn't consider Stravinsky as a religious man. She said that he applied himself to do everything very well. So if he wrote a circus polka or a mass or a sonata, or he involved himself equally, but not religiously. And she had, I think, a higher opinion of his music than even he had of his own. She was a composer but didn't compose for personal reasons of hers. And Stravinsky always said in portraits that he offered to people about her, he writes, "Она всё слышит," which means she hears everything. And so to him, that my teacher could hear everything meant all there is to say. Because most people hear a little, or more or less, or when they can, or according to the instrument they play. But she had this universal hearing. She detected things. People bring her a score and she could immediately detect the weaknesses in the writing. Not the stylistic things to say, nah, you shouldn't write this because it's passé, or you should write this because it's modern. It was more within the context of your piece. This is a weakness, this is a repetitivity, unnecessary, this and that. She will pinpoint things practical things, but not harmful things in a way of criticism about their own style or their own yearning. And I think they respected her a lot because of that. And if Astor Piazzolla studied with her, was not to study tango with her. It's like going to study hard rock with the Pope. Obviously, it doesn't come to mind at all. And when she asked him to play for her music of his country instead of Haydn sonatas he kept writing for his exercises or his assignments, he told me that he was terrified to play tangos to my teacher, because for him it was like sleazy music and she was a spiritually elevated person, therefore that was not right. And the fact that not only did she open his awareness of the spiritual, if not at least the profound true meaning that a tango has beyond the usage of it in nightclubs, became the fact that everybody plays his tangos today almost like you play a Beethoven sonata. Not perhaps as exactly, but almost. With a legitimacy that didn't have then. So if she wasn't open-minded, I don't know who was. But in fact, Stravinsky, like Picasso, had different styles through their life in different periods, so they could contradict themselves just because they're the creators. She used to say about Stravinsky, he always likes to betray the new friends he just made in terms of music. People loved the Rite of Spring. They wanted him to be always this revolutionary composer. And then he writes neoclassical and they go, oh. Then he used to say he'll never write serial. And after World War II, he wrote serial. And so people would say, he has no character, no personality, he just is a chameleon, he writes anything he wants and he has no structured belief. It's easy to say, but in fact, some of the composers like him evolved a lot through their time. Beethoven evolved a lot between Haydn sounding and the late works, because of course he was also deaf. You could say that he evolved a lot more. If you hear a Bach piece and another Bach piece, they all sound like a Bach piece. It's chromatic, it's complex, it's exciting, it's expressive, but it doesn't change style so much. Even if he tried to write in the Italian, in French, and in English, not really ethnomusicologically. Mozart sounds like Mozart throughout. But it's true that Stravinsky was disturbing because he contradicted himself, in fact, in his different styles. And she was probably the defender of his neoclassical period, the one who probably even brought him to think neoclassical during the years that she lived with him in Paris with the two mothers in the 30s. So who would have known how things would have evolved aesthetically? I don't know. It's the same thing as to say, if Schubert was 70, if Chopin was 80, and when you calculate in typical university teaching classes by time periods, you go like Bach died in 1750 and Chopin in 1849. So between Bach's death and Chopin's death, there are 99 years. It appears a lot, and at the same time is very short for the evolution of the style of music going from the Baroque to what we call the Romantic. But at least they were not all within the same person, even if perhaps they didn't have the same longevity of life. Who would have guessed Brahms writing the last intermezzi if he had died at 30 after the sonata in F minor? So perhaps Schubert would have written one movement sonatas, perhaps atonal sonatas, at the time he reached 70 or 80. Or perhaps he would have been like Rachmaninoff. He will just write constantly the same music, oblivious to the changes around. And I think that in all these cases, the reason for which we play them is not because they were more, let's say, audacious or less audacious. I think it's because each piece they left us that we like to hear or play or write about or conduct or whatever, record, talk about, or just enjoy living with, is meaningful regardless of its time period. Is for itself. And when you start looking at it in chronology, then it's a lot of overlappings and collisions. And I remember having told the widow of French composer Jean Francais, who died in 1997, I told her on the phone after he died, I said, finally he's timeless. Because all his life he was made fun of by most of the avant-garde composers that he was old-fashioned. Because he was alive. And nobody tells Brahms you're old-fashioned today, because we love him for what he is. Nobody says, yeah, but you know, Brahms, Debussy already wrote Afternoon of a Faun. What are you continuing to write your tonal things? If you tell them that, you would be trying to... in fact, you try to make them do what you would like them to do. And so the humility, I think, is to accept it and to serve it. And I would say that Richter, yes, was spiritual connection, and Stravinsky, I think, was a love, passionate love, and sadly unresponded love connection. That was the 7 minutes, huh?
Yeah.
I think there's 77 minutes. 777 minutes. Can't he stop talking?
Yeah, no.
I am wanting to play, I'm waiting to play, I'm nervous to play. And he cannot stop talking. I already warmed up and I'm cooled off.